Hey folks, welcome to another video in this series on levels of enlightenment for GitHub Copilot. These are some of the lessons learned that worked for me while I was using GitHub Copilot that get me to another level of getting more usage out of the tool. This video is for level 6 and that really tries to enforce usage of the chat by itself. So use the tools that you have available and get the most out of GitHub Copilot. And don't just look at Copilot suggestions and use that while you're typing. You can do so much more if you understand how the tool works and how it can help you with certain things. And that definitely means changing little things in the way that you work. I've already created another video where I go into depth of how I use the chat, for example, for a lot of tools that I use. I write a lot of DevOps script when I'm working in environments with a customer, for example. But starting to use prompting, prompt engineering, the lessons learned from those kinds of things really can be very beneficial. I'll drop a link to that other video in the comment section as well, so you can take a look at that if you want to. On screen, I've got an example of how I'm using prompting, in this case, to refactor things a little bit. So the first phase was already refactoring code out of it into another script file, for example, and then I just ask Copilot, how can I call into the script, set up all the parameters for me, saving me a lot of time of doing that by myself. And by using that more and more for things you want to do, including normal programming things, you can become a more powerful GitHub Copilot user. Let's switch to a short demo and see how you can incorporate that in your normal work. I still have the same example that I've been using throughout this series, our planes controller, where we have a list of planes from the Wright brothers, of course. We do everything in themes. And I have a REST API backend in C# in here. I currently only have a getAll, a getById, and a post method in here, and just then the plain list of planes in here as well. So I could go in and start building all the CRUD methods that I need for this REST API to become RESTful. I have everything in there, so that means I need to have a put message receiver in there. I need to have a delete. Maybe want to add something with a patch, and maybe want to add more options like filtering on certain things. And yes, I can go in, what I would normally do as a developer, start typing all that code myself, and Copilot suggestions will probably help me with a lot in there as well. So if I prompt it in here, it already says, hey, you're probably missing a put method in there, and then it will start implementing that put method for me. Then I can still read and validate what is in there, but all of that is quite a lot of work of doing that manually one by one. And I do know that I want to work in a setup where I have tests for everything, so I want to include that as much as possible. And I want to leverage Copilot as much as possible to write this for me. So if I remove that code, and I have just the three methods that we had, getAll, getById, and post in here, I can now start using the chat to let Copilot write most of that code for me. Not necessarily all of the code, but it can get me pretty far. And I can, for example, add a prompt in here saying, add all the missing REST calls to this class. And then since I know how I can use Copilot, I know that it uses context, one of the previous videos, of determining what I mean with the missing REST calls and what the context is for that. But I like to be more prescriptive to that, and instead of letting the IDE or Copilot figure that out by itself, I can just start saying in this file, for example, use the planes controller for that, and I don't need anything extra, but usually you see me doing things in a combination of a hashtag file where I want to be descriptive for something, and then a hashtag selection for the parts that I have selected, just to make sure that Copilot uses the context that I want it to use. You can now see that in the use to references. I'll open that when it's done as well, where it will pick up the location from the cursor as well as the hashtag file that I gave it as extra context as well. You can see that it says, hey, we are missing a put and a delete, for example. It starts to reason what needs to be in the put. And by adding that reasoning around it, it becomes better in projecting or predicting the next method that should be in there. And now it's writing that entire put method for me. Do note that this is potentially a bit slower because this is using a different foundation model under the covers. But still, you can imagine if this is a whole list of tests, for example, that you're writing, a whole test suite. This can definitely be faster than you going through that on a method by method basis and improving the results that are there and adding things in there as well. So I can just add that, for example, onto my cursor location. And instead of doing all that tab completion and prompting myself, we now have some integration in here. And you can see that even Copilot added some comments in here saying, hey, if there's logic to actually update a plane in the database, you need to call that yourself. It picked it up from everything that we have in this file. That currently we don't have a database layer, but it already says potentially you want to store that somewhere else. So maybe you should add that in here as well. And if you start working more and more with the chat, then you can get way more powerful results out of this as well. Similar to if I look at our solution, for example, we don't have anything in here. If I recall correctly, we do have a deploy workflow in here that already does certain things. But this is a workflow in GitHub Actions, just as one of the demos that we have in there. You can imagine that if you want to deploy this using Azure pipelines or maybe Circle CI or something, that you would start creating a new file and start doing that as well. Use the chat as much as possible and let Copilot do that work for you. So if we go into the chat, it helps if we just clear up the messaging. And I know from one of the previous videos that I want to potentially preload that with as much context as possible for that application. And in this case, I'm not interested in that. I just want to deploy that application. And I definitely don't want it to use the deploy from GitHub Actions that we have in the project. I want to create something new in there. Probably I would combine then something of add workspace, create the deploy pipeline for me to using Azure DevOps. What we learned in the previous video, that typos are just happy little accidents. You can just continue with that. So let's see what Copilot makes of this prompt as well, with all the typos that are in there right now. So with add workspace, my IDE, Visual Studio Code in this case, collects a lot of information of which files are important to give to Copilot as extra context. You can see it now fixes that by saying I used 7 different references for this. Potentially it picked up the solution file, for example, noting that this is a .NET Core application. And then it starts to write out the entire context for me, or the entire suggestion of how to use this with Azure DevOps as much as possible. You can see that we have tasks in there. Of course, I can't validate that from the top of my head, so I need to validate that by testing if this actually works. But it seems like it's a reasonable pipeline in here. So we run this on Ubuntu latest, which is indeed pretty common. We have the Wright Brothers API in a subfolder. It even picked that up. It knows that we're using .NET Core 5 in this version, for example. It picks up CS project files that we have in there. So there's already a lot of information in here that I can use to get started with. I might not like certain things in this pipeline. I see, for example, that the CI part is in the same stage as the actual deployment of the Azure Web App in the bottom here. And I would like to pull those out of each other and do that as separate stages, for example, so I can rerun a stage if necessary. Little things like that. But you can see that instead of creating that file and start typing myself, I let Copilot do 90% of the work for me, and then I can improve on whatever is in there. So that is the tip of this video. Use the chat for as much as possible. If you're refactoring something out of it, don't start refactoring yourself. Ask GitHub Copilot to do the refactoring for you. Then you have pulled that down into a separate script. Ask GitHub Copilot again. I now have a separate script. Give me the call to actually execute that script as well. Same for I need to create a method. Sometimes you can do that while you're typing in with suggestions in the file itself. But if you want to do more complex things, fall back and use the chat as much as possible, because that will make you a lot happier because there's way less typing involved there. So that brings us to the end of this video. Definitely check out the other videos in the series as well. I definitely learned a lot of these things while using GitHub Copilot over time. And these are some of the lessons learned of at least the last half of a year of using Copilot. So it's not something that you can just ignore. There's definitely a bit of a learning curve. Hopefully these videos help you as well to become a better GitHub Copilot user. See you in the next video of this series, of course.